This is the Hanwha Philly Shipyard in Philadelphia. It's the largest commercial shipbuilder in the US, and yet it hasn't built one since 2019. If we look at the US as a whole, it builds on average less than 5 commercial ships a year. Now compare that with everyone else. For a country with the largest economy in the world and a navy that depend on the sea for everything, that's just crazy. And what's even crazier is that the US was once the world's top shipbuilder back in the 1960s, but now ranks 19th, behind Malaysia and Taiwan. China, by comparison, has grown from about 5% of global shipbuilding output in 2000 to more than 50% today. But now the US is finally waking up to this weakness of theirs. Though to understand what they're doing to fix things, we have to go back to why the US stopped building commercial ships, like LNG carriers, oil tankers, and container ships in the first place. And the story begins when the US was on top. And I mean like their peak. Between 1939 and 1945, American shipyards built nearly 40 million gross tons of merchant cargo. That's over 3,600 cargo ships, 700 tankers, and 1,300 naval vessels, all in 6 years. They built more ships during World War II than every other nation on Earth combined. And for a few decades, they stayed there, number one by an enormous margin. From 1955 to 1985, US yards delivered an average of about 20 commercial ships per year. By the end of the 1970s, American shipyards employed 187,000 people. But here's the thing, none of this was happening on its own. The entire industry was being held up by 3 laws. The first was the Jones Act, passed in 1920, which required any vessel moving cargo between US ports to be American-built, American-owned, American-crewed, and American-flagged. The second was the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which created the Construction Differential Subsidy, where the federal government would cover up to 50% of the cost of building a ship in a US yard, just to make American prices competitive with foreign ones. And the third was the Merchant Marine Act of 1970, signed by Nixon, which expanded those subsidies even more and established a 10-year goal to build 300 new, modern commercial vessels in American shipyards. These laws were what kept American yards alive while the rest of the world started catching up. But then came 1981, when the Reagan administration came into power, looked at the subsidy program, and decided it was a free market distortion. In the fiscal year 1982 budget, they requested zero funding for new construction differential subsidy contracts. And that same year, the Transportation Secretary announced a 7-point maritime policy that severed the link between US operators and US shipyards. The reasoning was simple. Subsidies are distortionary. Let yards compete or die. And that's exactly what they did. They died. Within a few years, American commercial shipbuilding collapsed from globally competitive to barely existent. Active yards dropped by 40% and employment fell by a third. General Dynamics in Quincy, Sun Building Ship in Chester, and Bethlehem Steel in Sparrows Point all went out of business. Commercial ship production fell from around 20 large ocean-going vessels per year to just 5 within 8 years, and about 75,000 shipbuilding jobs disappeared. Between 1987 and 1992, the US sold only 8 commercial ships over 1,000 gross tons total, compared to 77 annually in 1975. Now, the Jones Act stayed in place, and it's worth taking a look at what that actually means. It created a small protected domestic market, so a handful of yards survived doing Jones Act work, building tankers and barges that moved oil from Texas to the East Coast, or container ships running between Hawaii and the mainland. But the costs spiraled. In the late 1920s, US-built ships cost 20% more than foreign equivalents. By the 1950s, 100% more. Today, a US-built tanker costs roughly 4 times what a foreign equivalent costs, and a US-built container ship can cost up to 5 times more. The Jones Act fleet collapsed from over 400 ships in 1950 to basically 100 today. Just look at this decline. The United States currently accounts for less than 1% of the world's commercial shipbuilding production by tonnage, with some estimates placing the US share closer to 0.1%. Meanwhile, while American shipyards were dying, the rest of the world was being heavily subsidized by their own governments. Japan dominated in the 70s and 80s. South Korea overtook Japan by the very end of the 90s. And then came the part of the story that matters most. China. Between 2006 and 2013, the Chinese government spent roughly $91 billion in subsidies on its shipbuilding sector, while the US, over that same period, spent about $1.5 billion. That's a 60-to-1 ratio. So it was basically state capitalism versus the free market, and the free market got crushed. China's market share doubled almost immediately. They held less than 5% of global tonnage in 1999 to over 50% in 2023. In 2024, China captured 74% of all new commercial orders, while the US captured just 0.2%. A single Chinese yard, the Jiangnan shipyard on Changqing Island, now has more capacity than all US shipyards combined. China's total shipbuilding capacity is about 232 times that of the United States. So why does any of this actually matter, when for 40 years nobody really cared? I mean, we're talking about commercial shipbuilding after all, not military ships. Well, about 90% of global trade moves by sea. The ships that carry American imports, exports, energy, and food are overwhelmingly built in China. In a major Pacific conflict, the US would depend on Chinese-built hulls to move its own military cargo. China also produces 95% of the world's shipping containers, 86% of intermodal chassis, and 70% of port cranes. The infrastructure of global trade is, at this point, mostly Chinese-made. Then there's the energy angle, and this is pretty wild. The US is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. Basically, every single molecule of American gas leaves the country on a foreign-built ship, mostly Korean. There isn't a single US-built LNG carrier currently afloat. The last LNG carrier built in the US was finished in 1980, scrapped in 2021. And there is actually a link to the Navy in all of this. Let me explain. Naval shipbuilding survived all this because it was federally funded, but the workforce, the suppliers, the forge shops, the specialty welding contractors, all of that depended on commercial volume to stay viable. When commercial shipbuilding collapsed, the supporting industrial ecosystem decimated with it. The naval yards now share a workforce pipeline that's just drying up, so commercial shipbuilding isn't really a commercial problem anymore. It's a national security one. And that's what the US government has finally started to realize. So now we get into what they're actually doing about it. The plan has two sides: preservation and production. In April 2024, President Biden launched a 9-month Section 301 investigation into China's shipbuilding sector. And a year later, Trump signed Executive Order 14269, titled Restoring America's Maritime Dominance. The centerpiece was a set of port service fees on Chinese-operated vessels, Chinese-built vessels, and all foreign-built vehicle carriers, which took effect on October 14, 2025. Chinese vessel operators would pay $50 per net ton, before rising to $80 per net ton in April 2026, which would keep going up year over year. The point wasn't really to raise revenue. It was to have shipping companies shift their orders to Korean, Japanese, or eventually American yards. But here's where it gets complicated. On November 1st, 2025, the Trump administration announced a 1-year suspension of the Section 301 fees as part of broader trade negotiations with China. So that's the preservation. Now the production side, which is mainly the SHIPS Act, was introduced on December 19th, 2024 and reintroduced on April 30th, 2025. The bill is trying to do three things: expand the US flag international fleet by 250 ships in 10 years, create a maritime security trust fund to subsidize the industry, and offer new tax incentives, including a 25% investment tax credit for shipyard investments. But the 250 ship target is worth taking a second to think about. The US currently builds around 5 commercial ships per year. To add 250 to the international fleet over a decade means adding 25 ships per year, on top of existing Jones Act and naval work. The industrial base would basically need to grow 5 times in capacity in a decade. That's not a small tweak. That's basically a wartime level of industrial mobilization, in peacetime, by an industry that doesn't really exist yet. Then on February 13th, 2026, the White House released America's Maritime Action Plan, branded as Make Shipbuilding Great Again. It's the most ambitious US maritime policy document since the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. But here's the catch. It's just a framework. There's no actual money attached to it. It still needs to come from Congress, despite the bipartisan support. As of now, the SHIPS Act is stuck. the Section 301 fees are still suspended, and the executive plan is mostly just a list of recommendations. So if the policy isn't delivering, what's actually rebuilding the industry on the ground? Well, this is where America's allies come to the rescue. In December 2024, the South Korean conglomerate Hanwha bought Philly Shipyard outright for $100 million. Philly Shipyard, founded in 1997 on a portion of the former Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, sits on 118 acres at the junction of the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, and it's built nearly half of all large ocean-going Jones Act commercial ships since 2000. It was really one of only 2 notable US commercial yards left, the other being General Dynamics National Steel and Shipbuilding Company, or NASCO for short, in San Diego. It was the first time a Korean shipbuilder had bought an American yard outright. And Korea is the world's second largest commercial shipbuilder. Hanwha Ocean, HD Hyundai Heavy Industries, and Samsung Heavy Industries are the kind of yards the US lost in the 1980s. Hanwha Ocean's Gyeonggi shipyard alone is about 52.7 million square feet, the size of about 900 football fields, with 30,000 workers and the world's largest dry dock and crane. Hanwha is also the world's leading LNG carrier builder and the first company to deliver 200 of them. While China dominates shipbuilding in quantity, it's fair to say South Korea dominates in quality and specialization. So the Philly acquisition was, more than anything, a technology transfer mechanism. They sent 50 Korean specialists from Georgia to start implementing welding robots and modern production techniques. Then it escalated. In August 2025, Hanwha announced a $5 billion infrastructure plan to expand Philly Shipyard, with the goal of scaling from fewer than 2 ships per year up to 20 per year, while the workforce would grow from 1,800 to an ultimate target of up to 10,000. Then in October 2025, at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, the US and South Korea finalized a $350 billion bilateral investment framework, with $150 billion of it specifically allocated to a shipbuilding cooperation initiative called MASCA, short for Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. It's kind of ironic when you think about it, an American political slogan, but the industry is Korean and the money is Korean too. If you're wondering why they're doing this for the US, paying money and teaching them this, they secured a reduction of reciprocal tariffs to 15%, down from a threatened 25%, and won US support for building its first nuclear-powered submarines, along with their submarine technology. So what's being rebuilt here isn't really American shipbuilding in the traditional sense. It's kind of an American-Korean hybrid thing, with Korean money, Korean engineering, and American workers, all happening under American policy. And honestly, there's a funny historical irony to it. The US fought the Korean War to save South Korea, and now the US has had to turn to South Korea for help. And this brings us back to the Navy, because everything I just described, the Korean partnership, the workforce pipeline, the supplier base, this is all the answer to a much bigger problem the US Navy is in the middle of. A 2025 Government Accountability Office report found that all 37 Battle Force ships under construction that they reviewed are facing delays. The Navy has shrunk to roughly 290 ships against a stated goal of 355, and is expected to bottom out at 280 ships in 2027. Of the Navy's 49 fast attack submarines, nearly 40% are in dry docks awaiting maintenance, with an average wait time for repairs of 3 years. But again, the Navy's problems aren't really just naval problems. These companies haven't forgotten how to build ships. What changed is everything around them. For example, the submarine industrial base has lost 12,000 suppliers since the 1990s. Over 75% of submarine parts have come from single-source suppliers. So if one small foundry in Pennsylvania goes under, an entire weapon system can grind to a halt. So if commercial shipbuilding revives, the Navy crisis slowly solves itself. If commercial shipbuilding doesn't revive, the Navy keeps shrinking. And that's why the Korean partnership is about more than just commercial shipping. Whether it works is a different question. China still dominates over half the global order book, and Chinese yards are still 4 to 5 times cheaper. China sanctioned 5 Hanwha US subsidiaries in October 2025 in retaliation for the partnership. But for the first time in 40 years, the US is at least trying to rebuild what it deliberately tore down, and it's doing it with Korean help. Because at this point, there's really no other option. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. I'll see you in the next one.